going to talk for a little while amongst us, and then try to save some time for some questions from the audience as well. But Bill, I was partly serious with my little joke. In terms of how we got to the present place we're in the country now, and you've been a harsh critic of President Trump and some of the things that have happened. You were a vocal never-Trumper. But in terms of the question of whether it was either certainly a school of thought that says the rise of conservative media and the unleashing of the further right libertarian Republican activism, that is a key part of how we got to what feels like a destabilized politics of the moment. But is that an unfair thing to lay at your feet?
Yeah, basically. But I'm used to it, right? It's great. It's great to get attacked from the left, attacked from the right. It's cheers me up.
I'll be very easy on you today.
No, Neera's the only person who's nice to me.
And I'm attacking from the center.
The Clinton Democrats and the never-Trump Republicans get along reasonably well. Look, I mean, it turns out, no, I mean, I think, look, I'm not a libertarian, but I mean, blaming Trump on the libertarians is a little weird. Trump's the opposite of that. It turns out, and there's a kind of populism on the right and on the left. Some of that populism seemed to be, at the time, to me, a healthy response to an excessively establishmentarian politics, to the failures of elites on both foreign policy and domestic policy, bipartisan failures, I would say. But on the Republican side, I was sympathetic to some of those revolts. And some of the people produced by the Tea Party and so forth were impressive, others not so much. I think Trump is a little sui generis. I do think the one thing I would say is people like me probably underestimated the degree. We always knew, as in any political party that gets 60 million votes, some millions of those voters are not motivated by high ideals or deep convictions or principles. They just don't like certain groups or certain people, or they hate people on the other side, even more than much more than they care about any positive agenda on your side. That's just a fact of life. You can't change human nature and human beings. I do think probably people like me underestimated maybe the size, but especially the strength of that tendency on the right in the Republican Party, exacerbated by many things: failures of the Republican establishment, objective things like wage stagnation and so forth, excessive hatred of President Obama, which sort of drove them a little crazy. Some things with conservative media that Nikki can talk about more than I, but that also changed over the years. I mean, I think Fox, which I was involved in on Fox News Sunday for about 10 years, was conservative, certainly. And though, of course, it was fair and balanced, but nonetheless, it wasn't quite fair and balanced, but it wasn't crazy, honestly, or very little of it was, And I think the move, and this is something historians and political scientists will have to really look at, the move from just being too ideological, a little bit blinkered, let's say, in the way you look at things, maybe a little bit too much knee-jerk hostility to big government and all this sort of stuff, or to, ascribing more power to political correctness than and more damage to it than it really has caused, though it's caused some. Where that morphed into really conspiracy theorizing and kookiness is a big question. But in 2011-12, we thought Trump's embrace of birtherism was a disgrace. I bet 3/4 of the people, 90% of people on Fox said that. I criticized Romney, I remember, for even accepting Trump's endorsement. I thought that was sort of inappropriate in early 2012. And if you had told me that 4 years later, the Republican Party, admittedly a minority of the total vote and so forth, would nominate someone who had been at the forefront of birtherism, I would have been surprised, and I honestly still am surprised.
Good, Nikki, yeah.
Yeah, I would actually sit at that moment where Mitt Romney takes Donald Trump's endorsement in 2012 and think about what the dynamics were, because I think that actually helps us understand Trump's purchase within the Republican Party. Donald Trump had been a regular on Fox and Friends, which is now a show he frequents and watches every morning.
Controls public policy in America.
And it does. And the fact that he was actually someone who regularly appeared on there, I think, matters, and that his okay was seen as something that Mitt Romney, who's a very different politician than Donald Trump, that Mitt Romney felt that he needed his endorsement or that he was getting something important from his endorsement, tells us something about how blurred already the line was between conservative ideology and conservative values, and then this more sort of effective conspiracy theorizing, trigger the libs kind of politics that Donald Trump represents.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to step back at or think about this as at a 60,000-foot level, I mean, I've been in politics for 20 years. I worked for Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama. We went through the 90s where there was a lot of, personal scandal, politics of personal destruction. I think at the really high level, you could look at the last 10 years and say that a lot of what's happened has been a reaction to a sort of far-right freak out in a lot of parts of the country, to a reaction, which has been a reaction to an African-American president, which I have to say progressives did not really anticipate. Sort of thought if you could get elected, wouldn't be that kind of seminal break. I mean, I was consistently astounded during the Obama years, the level of vitriolic hatred and personal hatred of Obama, who was, oriented towards politics. I mean, people forget this now, but his whole orientation towards politics, his 2004 speech was about red America and blue America, and I think the thing that shocked him probably the most was that there was this deep reaction to him. And I remember going through the 2012 budget negotiations, and I think he was literally shocked. People would threaten a debt trigger because they couldn't come to an agreement with him. And I think historians will evaluate how much of the rise of Trumpism is a response, and I'd have to say 100%, no excuse for it. I mean, a racist response, a xenophobic response to an African-American president is not justified. But we've had progressive presidents before who did not engender the rise of Trump. I mean, if you close your eyes and think of the polar opposite of Barack Obama in temperament, personality, way they look, except height, it is Donald Trump. I mean, there's like the most opposite person to hold the same job in the history of humanity, as far as I can tell.
And I want us to get into more, the missiles may be flying as we speak, so we got to get into the current before too long. But
if we start a war, someone could just shout out, that'd be helpful.
But on that, I don't particularly necessarily disagree with what you just said, Neera, about that the election of a black president triggered some of these things. At the same time, though, I wrote a lot about the Tea Party for the Wall Street Journal. I think I wrote the authoritative account of the beginnings of the Tea Party movement. But what was also so striking about that is that in both of the Obama election years, you also had a black Republican candidate who did extremely well for a period of time. I mean, Herman Cain turned out to be a big joke, but did lead in the polls. And so you have this perplexing thing of that some of the very same people who I think were alarmed by the sight of an African-American president in the White House, but also showed real support for a conservative African-American candidate at times. And I still can't quite figure out how to reconcile that.
Well, I think that Barack Obama acted as a catalyst for a lot of things that were already happening, because if you look in the 1990s and the 20aughts, you can see some of the same issue sets that were already being activated, whether it was by Pat Buchanan in 1991-92, who was also running on an America First campaign that blended protectionism and sort of more isolationist foreign policy with a bunch of culture wars issues. But also, if you look at what was happening with immigration during the Bush years and the ways that Republicans attempted to pass or to at least push immigration reform in 2005, 2006, and their base rose up against them. And that would happen again in 2013, I think. And so that dynamic was also in place, and that is at least one of the things that Donald Trump capitalized on.
Right, but I mean, the paradox is we crushed Buchanan. I mean, Buchanan surprised everyone because people were sick of 12 years of Reagan-Bush, and he surprised in New Hampshire. 96, he did surprisingly well. He lost badly. He left the Republican Party by 2000. Then there was the Ron Paul element, which I think overlapped a lot with Buchanan, and did lay some of the groundwork for Trump, because it wasn't really libertarian, and it was conspiratorial and America First-ish. But then
marijuana.
And he got beat badly ultimately, though he scared. And one thought, I thought, Okay, look, 20% of the Republican Party is Buchananite or Ron Paulite. There's just no denying that. It has been for 100 years, incidentally. It's not like that was never a part of the party. It manifests itself in an occasional congressman, probably 5, 6, 7 congressmen, maybe one senator occasionally, a candidate who gets 20% and then loses, in a couple of early primaries and loses. The Trump thing was astonishing because it took off. Maybe, I think Obama had a lot to do with it. It was a perfect storm. The hyperpolarization had a lot to do with it. I mean, Hillary Clinton had a lot to do with it. I would say, and I'm really saying this just analytically, this is not like good or bad, but I don't know. I mean, I think there was more hostility to Hillary, honestly, in that kind of, in the Trumpy base than even to Obama, perhaps. But the combination,
true.
I mean, I'm not saying this is good. And you know whether that itself has this, you can debate endlessly the reasons for that. So it was kind of a perfect storm if you think about it, though. I do think. And look, he didn't have to win. He also was incredibly lucky in the sense, and he's a very skillful demagogue, which he exploited issues well. An immigration issue he'd never cared about. He married 2 immigrants after all. I mean, literally, right? I mean, it's not like he hired them, he married them, he lived in New York. He couldn't care less about the immigration issue. There were businessmen, private sector types who funded anti-immigration efforts in 2005, 6, 7, who genuinely believe in a restrictionist immigration view, sometimes for good policy, not good for policy reasons, sometimes for more bigoted reasons. Trump was none of that. The only issue Trump ever cared about was trade because he had his own prejudices on that, but that was pretty different. He saw the immigration thing worked in 2015. He saw that it worked when he announced with the Mexican rapists. He saw that the Muslim ban worked, and he just doubled down on it. He is an effective, clever, and unprincipled demagogue. And he was very lucky also. I mean, if you think this, people want to change. Wages have been stagnating in the working class and some middle class. People just generally were frustrated and upset and wanted something new. And how would you stimulate a Trump? Well, you'd have the front runner for the Republican nomination be the son of a former president and the brother of a former president, and the front runner for the Democratic nomination, and indeed the Democratic nominee, the wife of a former president, and herself someone who was a long-time political figure and had almost been the nominee in 2008. And sort of, in that respect, Trump, he was clever in the way he capitalized on it, but he also was given sort of an amazing kind of perfect storm opportunity, which he took advantage of.
The only thing that I'll say really briefly about this is that I think on the whole sui generis question, which I think about a lot as we head toward the midterms and other issues, is I think we should recognize that when you look around the globe, there is a deep challenge, which is that populist, anti-establishment, xenophobic, nationalist, often racist, anti-Semitic campaigns are winning in countries. We used to think Berlusconi was the crazy person, and we now have the largest vote share for not just Five Star, but the Northern League, which is a proto-fascist group. UKIP has died down a little bit, but we had Brexit. And I think one thing that's instructive, not only for America, not only for the rest of Europe, but also America, is what happened in France was that you had a anti-establishment in a sense. Macron formed a new political party to take on the National Front. And so it was 2 issues of change versus change in status quo. Definitely the challenge in 2016 was it was a change versus status quo election in some real sense. Hillary had to argue, or she did argue, that she was an extension of Obama. That set her up poorly in a change election. So I think for Democrats going forward, it has to be really clear that there are 2 visions of change at stake, not a status quo versus change election. Donald Trump will be an incumbent. He will own the status quo. He's still a disruptor, but it is very different than him as a challenger.
Let's talk about him as president some. Now, we know that it has, whether you like him or dislike him, or wherever you are on the political spectrum, it certainly has been a chaotic feeling and looking and seeming year, 15 months that we've had. The firings by Twitter, the rollout of the travel ban, whether you think it was a good idea or bad idea, but sort of chaotic way of approaching it, tariffs, the off-the-cuff agreement to start talks with North Korea. A week ago, we're getting our troops out of Syria. Tonight, we're going to shoot missiles at Syria. I mean, all of that. But in the end, the Earth is still intact, and the...
I had this debate with someone earlier who was like, it's okay because like we haven't had a war and like it's not World War III. And I was like, well, if your perspective is the Earth has not collapsed, I guess it's going pretty well.
That is what's most important.
Get the bar low enough.
I had higher standards for America, but
But in the end, even if but in the end, presuming hopefully that we do endure or maybe even have a few successes during this period of time, in the end though, what's the real impact of this on the presidency or on the government, of the manner of governance that we've had over this past year? Where does it lead us?
I mean, I'd say, let's see what happens. We've made it through a year with a little less damage, obvious damage, I'd say, to foreign policy or the economy than I expected, though I think there's underlying damage in foreign policy that we could pay a big price for. But 1 year is 1 year, not 4 years. And we also got lucky. McMaster replaced Flynn a month in. We were in a pretty good economic recovery, and Trump, nothing much happened. He did some deregulation, basically. The tax bill came through at the end of the year, and so that continued. But I'm much more nervous about the next 3 years than I am about the first year, partly because some of the guardrails have come off, and he isn't getting more responsible. He's getting more impetuous, so far as one can tell, and more confident in his prejudices and in his ability to just run everything off the cuff. In terms of the effect, a huge amount will depend on where we are 2 or 3 years from now, obviously. But I think I'd say 2 lessons very, very quickly. I think the institutions have been pretty strong. I mean, that's a good, the founders set up the country well. It developed over 200 years. We have a strong civil society, pretty strong separation of powers, federalism, private sector, limited government. Liberals have rediscovered the virtues of the federal government having limits on its power, the president having limits on his power.
I wish conservatives had
Yeah,
done
well,
that.
so that's a good, so that has been, I think on the whole, though, if you came down and looked at the world, and we're not Argentina, we're not Venezuela, having a demagogue as president doesn't destroy the judiciary, the media, universities, the religious sector, and so forth. I mean, that's a really important thing. How much damage he's done to democratic norms is very hard to tell. That I would worry a lot about. Are previous presidents and previous successful politicians going to behave like Trump? Are they going to feel unembarrassed about demagoguing like Trump, demeaning opponents like Trump, categorizing whole groups of Americans in certain ways? That a lot of that's been outside or semi-outside respectable discourse, and now it's, how can you say it's outside respectable discourse when the President of the United States does it over and over? So there, I think the damage is very hard to tell. Again, a lot depends on the outcome of the Trump presidency. The world looks very different if Trump's reelected than if he's not. It looks different if he's redominated than if he's not. You can imagine, for me, best case, it's kind of a parenthesis, you might say, a bizarre moment in American history that we sort of move beyond. But that would really depend on him not being reelected and probably not renominated. If he's renominated, certainly if he's reelected, then you really have an inflection point in American history, or maybe you have something in between the two.
Yeah, I think the big question is, and one we don't know the answer to yet, is whether Trump is a one-off or whether he is the new normal. And we're going to need some time to figure out whether that's the case. And the thing is, like, Trump wasn't sui generis. Like, there were a lot of social and political and even technological and economic trends that led to his presidency that aren't getting better under his presidency. And so then the question is there a recommitment to a set of civil and social norms and ideas that people reinvest in, including faith in institutions and faith in journalism and media and facts and all these different things? And you can definitely see in some of the activism that's happening today that there are seeds for something like that. But seeds take time to grow, and it's hard to know what happens in 4 years or 8 years, much less 20 to 30. And so it's an open question, I think.
Just one footnote, I'll let Neera talk, but to that, I think I very much agree with that formulation and that way of posing the question. The only thing I would add is we have, and there were always these, in the past there have been trends that have been produced demagogues and bad moments in American history, John McCarthy, George Wallace, I mean, many of them, obviously. The big thing that one does have to factor in, of course, is that none of them really became president.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, not really, none of them became president, period. And you just have Joe McCarthy can do damage. At the end of the day, he's one senator. At the end of the day, the president, one party repudiates him, the other party maneuvers to ultimately repudiate him. He's censured by the Senate, and it's kind of over. And I think you could say by the late 50s, Joe McCarthy didn't have that much lasting impact on either party or on the U.S. What worries me, the reason someone like me is so anti-Trump, it's not just that I don't like him or, I'm annoyed that he's running the Republican Party. I think the damage he can do as president for 4 years is way out of proportion to the damage a George Wallace can do as governor of one state or Joe McCarthy as a senator from one state.
So I guess, I wouldn't disagree, I'll just add. My own view of this is that this is the, largest sort of existential question the country has faced. This could be an incredible inflection point that we're going through right as we speak. We see in the elections, Democratic participation is high. There's a Pew report Pew analysis last week that 60 million Americans have taken in some form of protest. There's large-scale social protests on an almost regular basis, mostly fueled by college-educated women. Gun march, the women's march, the marches that have been happening in between those marches, the town halls around the Affordable Care Act. We've done a lot of work on mobilizing protest in the political realm this last year, and there are people making phone calls for the first time to members of Congress. There are people going to town halls for the first time. So, we'll see in the midterms, and then obviously in the future, that whether this was a moment that was a fluke that created a counter response in favor of democracy. What I'm optimistic about is that when you look at Europe, where a right-wing nationalist populist country person has come to power, so a kind of perfect example of that is Orban in Hungary. The opposition really died down, got depressed, and demobilized. That has definitely not happened in the United States. We've seen a large-scale mobilization. People are very much looking forward to the midterms. If Democrats do not take power, I think that will be deeply depressing to a lot of people, and they may demobilize then. But we could be in a moment where we look back and say this is the time where, similarly in the 1960s almost, it was a big moment where big questions were debated, and a majority formed of Clinton Democrats and never Trumpers, and a whole range of other people to reject a politics of division. At the heart of everything Trump does, it is to divide people against each other. And in some of the elections we've seen so far, there's been repudiation of that, large-scale repudiation of that, even though ads have been meant to divide people and to attack immigrants, et cetera. So, we could be in a period where the country has grown stronger from what I would say is a moral, psychological, deeply divisive wound. That is the Trump presidency, in my view, and and we build a stronger democracy for it. That is what I'm hopeful for.
Of course, the other scenario is.
The other scenario is that he's Berlusconi and the National Front comes later.
Or the opposite, that that this repudiation that you see happening also means. There was a time when the crazy racist demagogues in America were all Democrats, and so the idea that things could swing, whether that repudiation is toward a more stable center or in another direction is another good question. But we're having a conversation now about America at the crossroads rather than the presidency at the crossroads. So let's bring it back to the presidency a little bit. Bill and Nikki have both offered their formula for why Trump was elected. Last month, Neera, I think you tweeted, the way Trump won was by cheating. Russian hacking, Russian bots. Impossible to say all of this didn't affect 70,000 votes. And then you've since said then his policies in office have aligned almost perfectly with the Kremlin's goals. Do you see it?
Yes, I stand by that.
You stand by that?
No, obviously, so it should be really clear. It's totally legitimate to say an election with Donald Trump should not have been close. I'm just saying everything we've learned over the last year, which is that there was a Russian media campaign, social media and external media campaign to support Donald Trump everything we've learned about Cambridge Analytica and the 87 million data points just indicates that it was not an equal playing field between the two campaigns that could have influenced 70,000 votes in my view. But it is obviously the case that we should all take note of a race that close with someone like Donald Trump. If you run a campaign against Donald Trump and you lose, your campaign failed. Hillary's campaign definitely failed, so I'm not saying it didn't fail. But there were problems on a whole host of things. I mean, my basic take is when an existential failure like a Trump presidency happens, a lot of institutions failed. The media failed. Our whole system of vetting failed. The Republican Party nomination process failed. The Democratic campaign against him failed. So, there's a lot of failure to go around. But I do think we will learn more and more about direct collusion between Donald Trump and the Russians to help elect him.
So let's stick on that, beyond the politics of it. So what does this investigation, which I think has, where we had, was yesterday, the day before, the search warrant on the president's personal attorney, these are new events. These are developments that we didn't see in Watergate and we haven't seen in previous presidential investigations. Are we moving, whoever's fault it is, are we moving into a kind of an era of perpetual presidential investigation, and where there's a kind of, Bill, what's your take on that? Is this all kosher, what's happening? Is it playing out the way that it should be playing out? Or, what?
Yeah, I mean, there should be an investigation of what happened, and Comey was investigating it with the FBI under the supervision of the Attorney General. If Trump didn't fired Comey, the Deputy Attorney General decided to appoint Mueller, extremely well-respected figure, as special counsel, and he's been investigating it, so it should play out. And we should see what he discovers. I think it's been done by the book. He's done a leak-free, and he's a man of great, I think, of good character and great accomplishment. And I think, yeah, absolutely it should play out.
And what if we get to a point not far from now where a number of other people end up indicted for various things or plead to certain things, but there's a conclusion by Mueller that the president didn't really have awareness of what happened?
Fine, then he won't be indicted. And I don't really agree with people who say, oh, the Democrats will impeach no matter what. I mean, if Mueller doesn't find reasonable grounds for Mueller may not say, if Mueller's report in whatever form it takes doesn't provide reasonable grounds for impeachment, I think enough Democrats will say, look, you can't just impeach him because he, is a very unpleasant guy and presided
kleptocrat, I think, is what the argument would be. But
presided over things that he shouldn't have presided over in Trump Tower and so forth, but he wasn't directly involved. So I'm pretty confident I have no idea how it will play out, but I think it'll play out appropriately. If he found things, he should report it, and Congress should see what they should do. And if he didn't find things, he'll report that. And then Trump will be president. So Trump should just let the investigation go forward. And I think it's really fake news for Trump to pretend that this is somehow crippling his presidency. It is not. The only reason it's crippling his presidency is because Trump's letting it cripple his presidency. No one's stopping Trump from focusing 12 hours a day on Syria, Ukraine, China, domestic policy, right? He doesn't have to be obsessed with this. Mueller has asked nothing of Trump and very little of the Trump White House. He's just investigating things. And if you're investigated and you have nothing to hide, you usually just let the investigation go forward.
And I would just add a few things to that. And one is that, when it comes to the interference in the election, there are lots of different things to parse out. A really healthy democracy probably wouldn't have been as vulnerable to the kinds of interference that the US experienced, and so it's worth thinking about the ways to shore up that democracy. But I do think that it's worth thinking about the ways that investigations of administrations have been deeply politicized over the past 10 to 20 years, which might have made it easier to kind of push back against the Mueller investigation. I mean, we saw kind of this endless investigations happening in Congress during the Obama administration that, and even the recent report that came out from Republicans in Congress.
There was no legal, Obama had no special counsels.
No, not
Bush,
at all.
In my opinion, unfairly, but anyway, one or two people in the Bush White House, good or Libby, were indicted for various whatever, tangential things, I would say whatever, for misleading Congress or misleading the FBI, and in his case convicted and then got clemency. Nothing stopped. Bush never commented on it. Not a single person in the White House criticized the special counsel or the Justice Department. So I don't buy the argument that somehow everyone's politicized and it's terrible and this is happening all over the place. The congressional inquiries on Obama and on Hillary Clinton, you could say we're tougher than normal maybe on Benghazi, but even so, no, but I mean, you laugh, but that's really, I mean, it did not disrupt the functioning of the Obama administration in the second term.
Absolutely not. I think the broad point you'd make is that there's one party that politicizes investigations, and it's been the Republican Party so far, which is there are like a lot of money spent on Benghazi, nothing determined at the end. Now, I mean, just state out loud, the House Intelligence Committee put forward a report, and Devin Nunes goes on Fox News as we speak to claim he's going to impeach the current FBI director, Christopher Wray, which I would just like to say, in the la-la land that we're in, I go on TV defending vociferously the integrity of the FBI, and Republicans go on TV, not this Republican, but other Republicans, vociferously attacking Donald Trump's own FBI director, not Comey, the one he selected, and the Department of Justice. So, I mean, I guess to say, I would affirm just very, very briefly. I worked in the Clinton White House during impeachment. Definitely a weird experience, okay? But Bill Clinton had lots of issues. He compartmentalized those issues. There was a lot of discussion at the time, how much he compartmentalized. And at the end of the day, right, at the end of the day, there's a broad understanding. If you are innocent, you do not act guilty by attacking the prosecutor every minute of every day. And what I think Donald Trump has done very effectively, using Fox News and the apparatus that he has. Everyone asks me, why does he always go to the base? It's because he has made it very, Mueller could indict tomorrow, right? He wouldn't indict. He could issue a report that clearly specifies a series of reasons why he should be indicted and impeached by the Congress. And I think that is absolutely the case. If he doesn't, Democrats will not do anything. If he does, it is a watershed event in the country because there's that much respect for him. But I do not believe in my bones this Republican House would do a damn thing with that report. And that is the discipline that Donald Trump has implemented on the Republican Party. Paul Ryan allowed Devin Nunes to viciously attack the FBI, and a large number of Republicans believe today that the FBI is out to get Donald Trump, which is ridiculous. It is a ridiculous notion, but that is the world we live in today.
So if we look forward to where these things are going, I mean, one question, of course, is it's the American people who are going to decide in 2020.
In 2018.
Well, in 2018 for sure, but when it comes to the, and in both these races, but certainly in 2020, the idea, assuming President Trump is still president, and assuming that he is a vigorous candidate for the nomination and the nominee for the party, all those things that Bill was referring to. But that's when the American people will decide what kind of presidency what they gravitate to. And I wonder what you think, very briefly. Does that mean that there's a likelihood of the 2020 race or campaigns between now and then turning into, an open question of restoring some sort of propriety and honor and tradition, or those sorts of rather traditionalist ideas?
I mean, I think at least, as we saw in Virginia last fall, almost all campaigns are going to more or less become referenda on Trump, just because he's such a huge figure now in the political scene. I would say there will be, I would just say on the Republican primary side, I am not conceding that he will be renominated. Right now, of course, he would be. But he will be challenged in the Republican primary. And I would say there are a lot of, the big day to watch for, I mean, the Mueller report is one huge independent variable. The other thing I think is what happens in November, and what do people do on November 7th, I think it's the day after Election Day, in 2018. And the way I'd put it in my Republic, there are a lot of Trump supporters, so maybe 40%, 50% of the Republican Party, they're just there. They're for Trump no matter what. There are a lot of reluctant Trump supporters. They didn't vote for him in the primary. They've sort of rationalized supporting him in the general. They've rationalized what he's done that's okay and that things have been kept in check. We haven't had World War III and the economy's been pretty good and so forth. And some of the people around him are respectable. It's one thing to do that and to bristle at some of the left-wing criticism and to not like some of the alternative policies and so forth and deflect a lot of your own feeling slightly guilty about defending Trump onto criticizing Hillary Clinton or Nancy Pelosi or something. It's another thing the day after Election Day to say, when someone says, well, what do you want for the next 4 years after 2000? You want Trump again? And I would say, since I know a lot of these reluctant Republicans and argue with them a lot, I think a lot of them are sort of, I don't want to be chastised for having voted for Trump. I don't want people like you, Bill, to be endlessly attacking Trump. Let's give him a chance. But, do I really want to go through another 4 years of this kind of craziness and the tweets and all the unpredictability? Maybe we could sort of say he did okay, shook things up. He was a disruptor, and maybe we could get back to something a little more normal. So I think the dynamic could shift pretty quickly the day after Election Day. I don't think it's automatic, but it could shift. And I think people will look at the current snapshot of especially Republican sentiment and say, well, Trump's unchallengeable. Look at all this approval rating among Republicans. That doesn't really capture, where the country might be in 2019 or 2020, but even where these reluctant Trump voters are. So I think there's a little more chance of a competitive Republican primary than people think.
I'll just say something.
Neera, before you guys jump in, this is the right moment to say some people write in headlines that Bill Kristol is going to run for president in 2020. And so
huge popular demand. It's unbelievable, really.
But it is true, though.
I can barely handle the emails.
It is true that Paul Ryan.
No, I'm not. So.
Paul Ryan. We'll say that again in a second. But Paul Ryan made his announcement today. I think 36 Republicans who are leaving their current positions, mostly in the House. Some running for other races or taking other jobs, but fairly historic voluntary departure. But you have said. I'm choosing not to, and of course those folks are not necessarily leaving the GOP, but you've said, I'm choosing not to leave the GOP, I'm choosing not to accept the Trumpification of the party as irreversible, prefer to fight rather than to switch. So why not run for president?
That would be, because I'd like someone to beat Trump, not to just be a sacrificial lamb. And I think other people are better qualified to be president than I, and I'd like to support one of them.
I guess one thing I would just to buttress Bill's point, which obviously has a much deeper expertise in the Republican Party than I do, but if you looked at what happened in the Republican primary before, the Republican primary in 2016, what really happened is he cornered the market amongst white non-college voters, and all the other Republicans split the vote amongst white college voters. And if they had actually had the Democratic Party's rules, which is proportional voting all the way through, there would have been a moment where it could have been one-on-one and much more equal. What they ended up doing is adopting these rules, which were winner take all, and by that point it was far gone. So there's a very long way of saying, I remember in 1994, after Bill Clinton got decimated in the Congress, in the country, mass. Bill Kristol's great work led to a red across the country. And what Bill Clinton spent his time doing behind the scenes in 1995, in front of the cameras, he was spending a lot of time negotiating the budget deal and taking on Gingrich, but behind the scenes, he spent a lot of time making sure Jesse Jackson did not primary him. A primary against a sitting president can be very effectively limiting the power of that person. But there can also be a lot of energy if Democrats, there's 34 governor's races, 36 governor's races up. Everyone knows about the House. Everyone knows about the Senate. If the country switches dramatically, the one thing people like to do in politics is go towards a winner. What Donald Trump always used in the primary was that he was a winner and he was winning. And he still argues to people he's winning and he's a winner and he's actually at 60% approval, not 40, and all this stuff. But if he presides over a dramatic, destruction of Republican Party around the country, I do think it's possible people will look and say, maybe there's an alternative.
Yeah, I think setting aside the larger question of what will happen to the country, I do think that there's an open question of what the Republican Party is going to be and what it's going to stand for. And as someone who has spent a career studying conservatism and thought she understood what conservatives stood for, and then, has seen the way that conservatives have voted and then talked about Donald Trump in various ways, it's not entirely clear what the Republican Party is going to look like in 2 years and 4 years and 10 years, and what it's going to stand for. And because we're in a two-party system, the way that the Republican Party reorients itself is going to reorient more broadly the conversations that we have about politics. So I think that it's important, even if you're not a Republican, to follow and invest yourself in the direction the Republican Party is going, because I think that is probably the most open question in politics right now, and one with profound consequences for everyone, even outside of the party.
Well, it's an interesting sort of historical detail. We often don't think of it this way, but I always say that we've really had a three-party system for more than a century. Up until the mid-1960s, though, there were two Democratic parties, the white supremacist Democrats of the South and the Union Northeastern Labor Party of the Northeast among Democrats. Then the Democrats, sort of by accident and tragedy, fell into, to some degree, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, those events of the mid-60s.
They did propel the Civil
Oh,
Rights
they
Act.
did.
It
But
wasn't
it's
like
there's
just
it's
happened
They
to
voted
the
for it.
well, but
parties.
without the sad assassination of John F. Kennedy, probably wouldn't have happened. Certainly not in the circumstances that it did. But so the Democratic Party ended up, though, without really setting out to do it, ended up expelling or taking steps that expelled the white supremacist wing of the party out forever, and then manifestations of that migrated more toward the Republican Party. And so the question now is, I think, for Republicans, is there a way, is there a formal way for the party to save itself, in effect, by orchestrating such an expulsion of sorts, or a separation between the two wings of the party?
I mean, but the way American parties work is they don't really formally expel anyone; they just defeat people. And I think this is where I totally agree with you. I mean, look, what does American exceptionalism mean? It means a lot of things, but really, literally, from a social science point of view, one of the things it means is that American conservatism was not mostly like European conservatism. Also meant that American liberalism was not like European socialism sliding into communism. I mean, that's literally what the social scientists meant in the 20s and 30s when they talked about American exception. We don't have a communist party, we don't have a fascist party. We don't have red and black fighting in the streets, whatever. We had some of it, we had a little bit of it in the 30s. Huey was popped up in places, Father Coughlin, Huey Long, but never at the national level. Why so much is at stake with Trump, from my point of view, is yes, you could have a Republican Party in America that is really a European-style conservative party, and a pretty nasty European-style conservative party, maybe a little closer to Hungary than to, a more respectable one. Yeah, not Christian Democrats. And therefore, that really would be bad for the country. And it would be bad for liberals, it would be bad for Democrats. I mean, you don't want one of your two major parties to be sort of outside what has been the sort of American common discourse. Maybe it's a little boring to have a center-left and a center-right party, but it's ultimately pretty healthy for the country. So that, I think, is what is at stake over the next, I agree very much with that, 2, 4, 6, 8 years.
And it's interesting thinking about events today with Paul Ryan deciding to drop out of the race, because the person that was sort of lurking in the wings in the Republican Party was Paul Nehlen, who is kind of this alt-right racist figure. And I don't think that he's going to win that election, but when you have all of these folks like Jeff Flake just kind of not running for election again, it leaves it as an open question who's going to fill in that vacuum.
But see, I mean, I just need to say, it's so interesting. I mean, for years, and I'll say this really briefly, for years, people saw Paul Ryan's libertarianism, anti-welfare state, pro-tax cut theory of the world as the dominant political theory of Washington. And I mean, I think today we basically have learned that the Paul Ryans are dead in the Republican Party. No offense, Don, but like, whatever happened, Paul Ryan has conceded to Donald Trump that he controls the Republican Party. Now, the good news to me is people, I mean, probably not for you, but maybe it is. Republican identification is Donald Trump's hold in the Republican Party. Republicans agree with Donald Trump 85%. The people who are identifying as Republican is declining. So it is like people who don't like Donald Trump are just leaving and becoming independent. They're not becoming Democrats, they're just becoming independents. But it is, you know, the tariffs, the xenophobia, the anti-immigrant position, that is the opposite of everything Paul Ryan has ever stood for. And that is not the discourse of the Republican Party today. So, I mean, it could be he's going to lose, but it really seems to me like he's like, I'm not a leader of the Republican Party anymore.
The drama of 2012 to 2018, I guess historians will write it this way, is Romney takes Ryan as his VP, and that sort of solidifies the notion that this is the future. You can agree or disagree with it, but a serious attempt to deal with economic growth, entitlements, but a sort of rather liberal on immigration and so forth, free trade party, internationalist in the Reagan tradition, and that by 2018, Ryan is driven out, in a sense, of the speakership. It is a pretty remarkable trajectory to have gone in 6 years.
One of the most fascinating documents for historians going forward is going to be that GOP autopsy after 2012, because the party goes in such a dramatically opposite direction.
Yeah, and worked. So let's take some questions from the audience. I can't really see any of you, but except faintly. But
There are people here then.
that's right. I think we've got a couple of folks with microphones, and
Microphone
all right. So yeah, that's right. So if you'd like to ask a question, then wave down one of the microphone pilots, as we call them.
some here.
All right, here we go, right here.
Over here. Okay.
Let's take a question here. Yep.
So we can spend lots and lots of time talking about Trump, but my question to all of you is, how do we ensure the next generation and the generation after that get the appropriate understanding and education of civics and democracy and what the country used to stand for as a set of shared ideals?
It's a great question. I mean, I guess what I would say is that if you actually look at what's happening in the country, people are getting that experience every day. The teacher strikes are happening. We have levels of protest across the country we haven't seen, in which people are actually engaging in direct democracy to change the outcome. I do not believe we would have saved the Affordable Care Act if it were not for hundreds of thousands of people who have health care. The vast majority of people who engage in the defense of the ACA are people who have employer-based coverage. They were never going to lose their coverage, but they cared about other people losing their coverage. And so I think, and just to say, amongst millennials, their opposition to Trump is like 3-1, 66% on a bad day. And white millennials oppose Trump more than any other group of whites. So, I mean, if you're looking at a long-term trajectory, we could look at this moment and say, what happened in America is just California in 1992, which is Pete Wilson won, but it did create an inflection point for the country.
Yeah, I'm a critic of American higher education, civic education. No, I mean, I think we don't do a very good job of it in all kinds of ways that many, many people across the political spectrum have worried about and agreed. On the other hand, I very much agree with Neera. It is kind of ironic. Trump's strongest supporters are Americans 65 and older who allegedly were educated in the golden age of civic education, which was in some ways, I mean, ironically was, I think, better in some ways. Millennials who've gotten so little of the history and the civic education and are distracted with their phones and all this sort of stuff are the most resistant to Trump. So I do think it gets back, and this is a point that I think Nikki sort of hinted at before, we didn't really, I mean, this is where automation, technology, globalization, I mean, real world events have shocked older Americans in ways that have made them open, unfortunately, in my view, to Trump. But I do think, to their credit, younger Americans have been somewhat resistant to it.
Yeah, I would just backstop that and say that I think we make a mistake if we boil down all of the problems that are happening right now to problems of education. Because I think that it's not necessarily always a problem of knowledge, but it's just it's a difference of worldviews and interests that sometimes get recoded as issues of education, which they're not necessarily.
It's also worth remembering that the folks historically, over the last 50 years, the folks who've been who've had the biggest problem with civics-driven activity in schools and the Pledge of Allegiance and such. Those concerns about that came from the left and a worry about indoctrination by the government. And so it's probably worthy of a rethinking about the importance of some of those central mores. I also saw some data recently related to presidential contenders on the Democratic side. And what was particularly interesting about that to me was that among these millennial voters, when the Obama messages of hope and change were tested on them, they had absolutely no interest, complete disinterest and sort of rejection of that. What they really liked were the notions of Democratic candidates who were going to be fighters and that they really want someone to punch back. And so I think that's an interesting, what that may portend for what's coming is interesting too. But let's get another question. Sure, right there.
Kind of a natural follow-up to the previous one. My question is about presidential debates. In the last round, the Republican and Democratic parties and broadcast network personnel showed their incompetence to control the participants and allowed much talking over and interjection, often like a form of the Jerry Springer show. Can we revive sponsorship by the League of Women Voters or commission members of the National Association of Parliamentarians to conduct an enforceable by rules civil debate? Am I the only one who cares about this? What are the prospects for such a revision?
I mean, it's a lovely idea. But you could imagine, I mean, just imagine the 17 contenders in the Republican debates sitting down, and Donald Trump's one of them, and you're trying to have the League of Women Voters enforce Robert's Rules of Order on this debate. Like, it's probably going to go about the same as it went.
I mean, I also have to say, look, I think we should recognize Trump is transforming everything, right? So he governs by tweet. Everything is a form of WrestleMania or Mortal Kombat. I mean, turn on your TV, turn on the way people sell their books. Like, I mean, I think I am as open to attacking the media as anyone else about things, particularly after 2016. But I think we actually also have to look in the mirror that something has allowed the world, the country, to be governed by reality TV show. I mean, I think 50% of what Trump says about firing people or not firing people is all his way of dominating news coverage, because you have a bunch of talking heads who are like, will he or won't he? Will he or won't he? Just like, is he going to fire this person or is he going to fire that person in The Apprentice? And I think we have to recognize that that is a problem with us, not with just the media, but with us. You know, like he gets high ratings. Shows that do this get high ratings. Like, it's our fault. People are like, nobody needs to watch, and they do.
There was some journalistic malpractice, though, some terribly incompetent performance, including by some friends of mine. So, but I won't name them. Let's get another question in. Sure, right here.
Hi, mine has to do with misogyny in the GOP. I worked for
Misogyny and sorry, what
in
was
the
it?
GOP. I worked for a senator back in the 80s and saw from the inside. It was Al D'Amato, and I saw from the inside when Geraldine Ferraro became the vice presidential nominee, how they really masterfully went for the jugular, and it was really because she was a woman, a strong woman. And you know, as soon as Hillary Clinton came in with Bill Clinton, you saw it happen again and again. And there was a lot of that underlying with the election that kind of got ignored. Can you guys address that a little bit?
Why don't I take a stab? I think, you know, there's been lots of studies about women who seek executive jobs needing to express their ambition in ways in which there's, you know, you can't express your ambition openly. You have to be about serving other people. I mean, there have been a lot of books written. There will be a lot of books written about the treatment of Hillary Clinton by the media and misogyny. The true test, I think, will be a lot of reporters, many of them are my friends, believe that it's not women who engendered negative coverage, it's Hillary. It's the baggage of Hillary, it's her personality, it's her character. I think people around Hillary would say there was a box of running for a very male job, being a woman. But this will get litigated in 2020 or 2019 There will be multiple women candidates who run in the Democratic primary, which I am very excited about. How they are treated will be the test of whether it was Hillary Clinton or misogyny. And I think we will find that we will have to do a lot of work as women to discipline the discourse around women candidates, but I'm hoping I'm wrong.
I do think that there was a big blind spot in the coverage in 2016 of the way that misogyny was operating, and I don't even know that there was space to have that conversation, but I do think that what we've seen in the 15 months since, I mean, it's not just Hillary Clinton being a woman, but it's that she was running against a person who is openly misogynistic, and that everything from the Access Hollywood tape to the Women's March to the tens of thousands of women who called up to Emily's List and decided that they were going to run for office, and who here in Virginia have successfully run for office. I think that it's not just that they're a test of whether misogyny played a role in Hillary Clinton and the 2016 election, but they're evidence that women at least felt that misogyny played a role in the 2016 election. They felt silenced by the results of that election and are trying to reverse course on that. And what we've seen in the past 15 months is women saying that there needs to be a different kind of politics in the United States, and then modeling and creating that new kind of politics.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief about this. Women, if you look at all the protests we've had, the gun march, fronted by a lot of incredible teenagers, but the actual marchers, the teacher strikes, the healthcare rallies, and obviously the 2 women's marches, which were the largest protests in American history. I absolutely agree. It is a primal scream amongst women saying the election of Donald Trump, not all women, but lots of women, particularly college-educated women, the election of a man who had the Access Hollywood videotape, who said the things he did, that now we have 19 women who've come forward saying they were assaulted, and he still got elected against one of the most qualified women in the history of the country, is an assault on our dignity. And I think it's going to reverberate. These 86%, this was a poll last year, 86% of the new advocates, new people who are coming into politics, are women. They are mostly mothers, 35 to 55. They have the ability, if they stay in politics in 2018 and 2020, they can transform the country, not for these 2 elections, but for decades to come. And that is the leverage point that I think we may be in.
And one thing for certain that we know from all politics, as Donald Trump proved in his own way, is that if large numbers of voters gravitate to a particular model of behavior or beliefs on the part of candidates, if that begins to win elections or appear to be a tipping point in tight elections, then lots of other political figures and leaders begin to adopt the same model. And so again, it's back to some of that looking in the mirror. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's been a great conversation. Thanks to our guests. And thanks to Tom Tom.